Today's lesson is proving a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. There are 5 ways I can prove that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. Let's just review. What is a quadrilateral? So a quadrilateral is a 4-sided polygon. And parallelograms mean, parallelogram is I have 2 pairs of parallel sides, is my definition of this polygon. Okay, the first way I can prove that I have a parallelogram is show that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. So I show these with arrows. So I can show these 2 sides are parallel, and these 2 sides are parallel, but they're not parallel to each other, so I have different amounts of arrows. I can also show that both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. So I can show these 2 sides are congruent, and these 2 sides are congruent. But they're not necessarily the same size, so I do different amount of tick marks. I can also show that both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. So I can show that this pair of angles is congruent and this pair of angles is congruent, but they aren't necessarily congruent to each other, so I have 2 different size arc marks, or 2 different sets of arc marks. I can also show that one pair of opposite sides are parallel and congruent. So I can either show that this side is parallel and congruent, or I could show that this side is parallel and congruent. Doesn't matter, but one side that's both parallel and congruent. Or I could show that the diagonals bisect each other. So the diagonals I connect from non-consecutive vertices, and I can show that I'm bisected by showing these 2 segments are congruent and these 2 segments are congruent, but not necessarily with each other. All right, so let's do some examples here. In quadrilateral ABCD, AB, the distance from A to B equals the distance from B to C, and the distance from C to D equals the distance from A to D. Is polygon ABCD a parallelogram? Why or why not? Okay, so when I'm naming my parallelogram, I name my vertices consecutively. So A, B, C, D. So I need to name these consecutively. Okay, so let's put in my information. So A to B is congruent to B to C. And C to D is congruent to A to D. Okay, so this one, no, is not, because it isn't properties. One to 5 do not apply. Okay, this is not one of the 5 properties that we just talked about. All right, let's try number 2. In quadrilateral WXYZ, so W, X, Y, and Z, the measure of angle X is 138 degrees, and the measure of angle Y is 42 degrees. Find the measure of angle Z. Here's angle Z. So I am going to find the measure of angle Z And I'm going to use the fact that I know that 138 degrees plus 42 degrees, when I add these two together, I get 180 degrees. So I have consecutive angles are supplementary. So this is just asking me to find the measure of angle Z. So I'm going to say that since I have consecutive angles, I'm going to say yes, because I have consecutive angles are supplementary. Okay, so that was one of the properties that we talked about in a previous lesson. So my answer is going to be yes. Okay, for number 3, for what values x and y is quadrilateral PQRS a parallelogram? So the values to make it a parallelogram would be that my opposite sides are congruent. So I'm going to set up some equations. So I'm going to say x plus 9 equals 2x minus 1. And y equals x plus 7. Okay, so solving the equation on the left first, I'm going to subtract x from both sides. So 9 equals x minus 1. I'm going to add 1 to both sides, so this is called adding the inverse. So 10 equals x. So I solve for x. I'm going to go substitute here. So y equals 10 plus 7, so y equals 17. So I solve for y. So when x is 10 and y is 7, I have opposite sides are congruent, so that makes that a parallelogram. Okay, so for what values of x and y is quadrilateral ABCD a parallelogram? Okay, so this time I want to say my opposite angles are congruent, or my consecutive angles are supplementary. Okay, so I know angle A and angle C are congruent, and angle D and angle B are congruent. So I'm going to set up two equations. So 2x equals 3x minus 32, and 4y equals y plus 87. Alright, so I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. So I get 0 equals x minus 32. I'm going to add 32 to both sides. So 32 equals x. So I got to solve for x. Okay, now let's solve for y. So I'm going to subtract y from both sides. So I get 3y equals 87. Divide both sides by 3, so that's dividing by the coefficient next to the variable. So I get y equals 29. Okay, so when my opposite angles are congruent, I have a parallelogram. All right, let's try number 5. For what value of x is quadrilateral CDEF a parallelogram? Okay, this one is talking about the diagonals. So when my diagonals are bisected, I have a parallelogram, so I'm going to say 3x equals 5x minus 8. So I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. So 0 equals 2x minus 8. I'm going to add 8. 8 equals 2x. Divide both sides by 2. And I get 4 equals x. Okay, so I solve for the variable. So when my diagonals bisect each other, my quadrilateral is a parallelogram. Okay, so what property proves my diagram is a parallelogram? So is this property 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5? Okay, so number 6 is property 4, where I have opposite sides are parallel and congruent. Okay, so this is showing me 30 and 30, so there's my parallel and congruent. Here I have property number 2, both opposite sides are congruent. And this one is talking about the angles, so my opposite angles are congruent, so this is property number 3. Both pairs of opposite angles congruent. Okay.